I never expected that a high-stakes project at work would completely change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It wasn't about the promotion or the bonus. It was about the long nights, the shared takeout containers, and the man who, for months, had been nothing more than a pleasant, unattainable feature of my office landscape. His name was Caleb, and he was about to unravel the quiet, predictable world I had built for myself. My name is Lucas. Before all this, my life ran on a schedule as clean and predictable as the code I analyzed every day. I was a data analyst for a mid-sized tech firm, a job I was good at and generally enjoyed. It was a world of numbers, patterns, and logical conclusions. My apartment was minimalist and tidy. My weekends were a comfortable rotation of jogging, laundry, and streaming services, and my social life was efficient. I had friends, of course, but I had grown accustomed to a certain level of solitude, a quiet hum of loneliness that I mistook for peace. The office was my primary domain, a sprawling open-plan space with gray carpets, ergonomic chairs, and the constant, gentle clatter of keyboards. I had my corner, my sanctuary, with a small succulent I'd named Seymour and a perfect view of the coffee machine. From this vantage point, I observed the daily orbits of my coworkers, and for the past year, my observations had been drawn, almost magnetically, to one particular celestial body, Caleb. Caleb was a project manager. He was the kind of person who didn't just walk into a room. He seemed to brighten it. He had a laugh that could cut through the dullest Monday morning meeting and a confident, easy way of moving that suggested he was always exactly where he was supposed to be. He had broad shoulders from years of college rowing, I'd heard someone say, and his dark hair was always a little bit messy, as if he'd just run his hands through it while solving a complex problem. To me, he was in a different league entirely. He was extroverted where I was introspective. He commanded attention without trying, while I did my best to blend in. I'd watch him at the whiteboard, gesturing emphatically with a dry erase marker, and feel a pang of something I couldn't quite name. It was more than just admiration for his professional competence. It was an ache, a quiet longing for a connection I was sure I could never have. He was friendly, of course, in that universally charming way. He'd say, "Morning, Lucas," with a genuine smile as he passed my desk, and my entire day would feel a little less gray. But that was the extent of it. He was, in my mind, firmly and unassailably straight, a landmark in a country I could only visit as a tourist. My routine was built around these small, insignificant interactions. I'd time my coffee runs to coincide with his, just for the chance of a brief exchange about the weather or a new office policy. I'd listen to his conversations, not as an eavesdropper, but as a student of his character. I learned he was kind to the new interns, that he took his coffee black, and that he had a soft spot for the ridiculously elaborate donuts someone brought in on Fridays. Each tiny detail was a piece of a mosaic I was building in my mind, a portrait of a man who didn't even know I was painting. This was my life, watching, analyzing, and keeping a safe, professional distance. I had accepted it. It was easier that way, wasn't it? To want something from afar, where the risk of rejection was zero. But life, I was about to learn, has a funny way of taking your carefully constructed plans and setting them on fire. The inciting incident, when it came, didn't feel like a seismic shift. It felt like another Tuesday. It arrived in the form of an all-hands email from our division head, a woman named Maria, who communicated exclusively in corporate jargon and exclamation points. The subject line read, "Project Nightingale. All aboard for innovation." I sighed, expecting another tedious initiative that would ultimately go nowhere. But this was different. Project Nightingale was a massive, high-priority undertaking for a new client, with an impossible deadline. It was the kind of project that legends and nervous breakdowns were made of. Maria called a meeting in the main conference room. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and anxiety. She clicked through a presentation filled with aggressive timelines and synergy-focused buzzwords until she reached the final slide, the team structure. My name appeared under Lead Data Analyst. I felt a familiar knot of performance anxiety tighten in my stomach. I was good at my job, but being the lead on something this visible was outside my comfort zone. And then, right next to my name, I saw it. Lead Project Manager, Caleb Mitchell. My heart did a strange sort of flip-flop, a mix of sheer terror and a dizzying, completely inappropriate thrill. The core team for Nightingale will be working out of the annex conference room for the duration, Maria announced, gesturing toward the glass-walled room at the far end of the floor. It'll be your war room. Eat, sleep, and breathe this project, people. The client is expecting miracles. Just like that, my carefully maintained distance was obliterated. The safe orbit I had established around Caleb was gone, and I was being pulled into a direct collision course. A war room. The term itself sounded ominous. It promised long hours, high stress, and inescapable proximity to the one person who could make me forget how to speak in coherent sentences. I looked across the table, and my eyes met Caleb's for a fraction of a second. He gave me a small, encouraging nod, a little smile playing on his lips. It was meant to be a gesture of solidarity, a "we're in this together" look. But for me, it felt like the click of a roller coaster locking into place just before the big drop. There was no getting off now. The next morning, the war room became our new reality. It was a sterile space with a massive whiteboard, a long central table, and a view of a brick wall. The air hummed with the quiet whir of laptops and the scent of fresh, dry erase markers. For the first few days, our interactions were strictly professional. We mapped out timelines, delegated tasks, and debated methodologies. Caleb was even more impressive up close. He was a master of organized chaos, keeping a dozen moving parts in sync with an almost preternatural calm. He'd lean over my shoulder to look at a spreadsheet, and I'd have to consciously remind myself to breathe. The faint, clean scent of his soap, the warmth radiating from his arm just inches from mine. It was a sensory overload that my analytical brain struggled to process. I threw myself into the data, finding refuge in the familiar comfort of numbers. The numbers didn't make my palms sweat. The project was relentless. Days blurred into nights. The sun would set outside our window, casting long shadows across the whiteboard, and we'd still be there, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a shared sense of impending doom. The rest of the office would empty out, the clatter of keyboards fading until it was just the two of us left in the quiet hum of the building's climate control. The professional facade began to crack under the pressure, slowly replaced by a weary camaraderie. It started with food. Around 7 one evening, my stomach let out a growl so loud it seemed to echo in the silent room. Caleb looked up from his screen and grinned. Hungry. I felt my face flush. A little. He stood up and stretched, his shirt pulling taut across his back. My treat. What are you in the mood for? There's a decent Thai place that delivers. It was the first time we'd spoken about something other than Gantt charts and data streams. It felt normal, and that normality was, in its own way, terrifyingly intimate. We ate out of takeout boxes, sitting at opposite ends of the long table. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was comfortable, companionable. It was in these quiet moments that I started to see the person behind the project manager. I learned that he doodled. When he was thinking, he'd fill the margins of his notepad with intricate, geometric patterns and surprisingly detailed sketches of buildings. One night, I pointed to a particularly elaborate drawing of a Gothic archway. That's really good, I said, my voice softer than I intended. He looked down, almost shyly. Oh, thanks. I wanted to be an architect. Once upon a time, he told me about his grandfather, a carpenter who had taught him how to draw and build things. He spoke with a quiet passion that was completely different from the confident energy he projected in meetings. He was revealing a piece of himself, a vulnerability that chipped away at the pedestal I had placed him on. He wasn't just the handsome, charming project manager anymore. He was Caleb, the man who dreamed of designing buildings. And that, I realized with a jolt, was infinitely more dangerous for my carefully guarded heart. The small moments began to accumulate, each one adding weight to a feeling I was trying so hard to ignore. There was the time I was shivering, the office air conditioning working overtime, and when I came back from the restroom, his gray fleece jacket was draped over the back of my chair. He just nodded toward it and said, "You looked cold," without missing a beat in his typing. I wore it for the rest of the night, enveloped in his warmth and a scent that was subtly, uniquely him. Then there was the coffee. I had offhandedly mentioned to another coworker weeks ago that my favorite coffee was a specific blend from a small independent shop a few blocks away, the kind of place you had to go out of your way for. I'd forgotten I'd even said it. But one morning, after a particularly brutal late night, I walked into the war room to find a steaming cup of that exact coffee waiting on my desk. Caleb was already at the whiteboard, wrestling with a logistics problem. "Figured you could use a real coffee today," he said over his shoulder, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the cup. It was such a small thing, a $5 cup of coffee. But it wasn't about the coffee. It was about the fact that he had listened. He had paid attention to a random, throwaway comment I'd made, remembered it, and gone out of his way. Hope is a treacherous thing. It had been a dormant seed in my chest for so long, and now, with these small acts of kindness, it was beginning to sprout. I was terrified of what might happen if I let it grow. But as I sat there, sipping the best coffee I'd ever tasted, I realized it might already be too late to stop it. The lines were blurring, and the carefully drawn boundary between Lucas the coworker and Lucas the man was beginning to dissolve. The turning point came on a Thursday night, 2 weeks into the project. We were on the verge of a major breakthrough, but we were also running on fumes. The whiteboard was a chaotic mess of diagrams and crossed-out notes. Dozens of empty coffee cups littered the table like fallen soldiers. We had been at it for 14 hours straight, and the world outside the war room had ceased to exist. Finally, around midnight, I found the anomaly in the data set we'd been searching for. It was the key. "I think I've got it," I mumbled, my voice hoarse. Caleb rushed over to my desk, leaning in so close I could feel the heat from his body. He stared at the screen, his eyes scanning the lines of code. A slow smile spread across his face. "Lucas, you're a genius," he clapped a hand on my shoulder, a firm, warm weight that sent a jolt straight through me. The relief was intoxicating, a giddy rush that made the room feel like it was spinning. "We did it," he said, laughing, a genuine, tired, triumphant laugh. "We actually did it." He straightened up and ran a hand through his hair, looking utterly exhausted but completely alive. "Come on," he said. "Let's get out of here. We can't look at this room for one more second." We packed up our bags in a shared, weary silence. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a profound exhaustion in its wake. The main office was dark and cavernous, the only light coming from the green glow of the exit signs. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the buzzing energy of the workday. It felt like we were the only 2 people left in the world. We walked down the long, empty hallway toward the elevators. Our footsteps echoed softly on the linoleum. I was hyper-aware of everything. The space between us, the rhythmic swing of his arm next to mine, the way the low light caught the angles of his face. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the accumulated weight of the past 2 weeks. My desk was in a small, partitioned-off area just before the main exit. It wasn't quite an office, more like an alcove. As we reached it, I stopped to grab the jacket I'd left there earlier. "Well," I started to say, the standard, awkward end-of-night pleasantry forming on my lips. "I guess I'll see you tomorrow." Caleb stopped too. He didn't move toward the exit. He just stood there, looking at me. His expression was one I'd never seen before. It was intense, searching. "Lucas," he said, and his voice was low, almost a whisper. He took a step closer, and then another. My back was against the cool metal of the doorframe of my little alcove. I had nowhere to go. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silent office. He raised a hand, not to touch my face, but to brace it against the frame just beside my head. He was so close now. I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. He was still looking at me with that same searching intensity, as if he were asking a question without words. I was frozen, trapped in the gravity of the moment. I could feel his breath on my skin. And then he leaned in. It was a slow, deliberate movement. There was no mistaking his intention. He closed the last inch of space between us, and his mouth met mine. It wasn't a hard, demanding kiss. It was soft, tentative, questioning. His lips were warm and gentle, a stark contrast to the cold shock that was racing through my veins. It lasted only a few seconds, but my entire world tilted on its axis. He had walked me down the hall and stopped me by the doorframe with his mouth. It was a sentence that made no sense, and yet it was the only thing that was real in that moment. He pulled back just as slowly as he'd leaned in. His eyes were wide, and for the first time since I'd met him, Caleb looked uncertain. He looked vulnerable. He didn't say a word. He just held my gaze for another heartbeat, his expression a mixture of apprehension and something I couldn't dare to name. Then he dropped his hand from the wall, turned, and walked out the main doors, leaving me standing alone in the silent, echoing darkness of the office. I stood there, with my back pressed against the cold metal, my lips still tingling, and my mind a complete and utter blank. The next morning was excruciating. I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all, the ghost of that kiss still lingering on my lips. Every nerve in my body was frayed with a mixture of hope and paralyzing fear. What did it mean? Was it a fluke? A stress-induced moment of madness brought on by exhaustion and relief? Or was it something else? Walking into the office felt like walking onto a stage without a script. I was terrified of seeing him. I was terrified of not seeing him. I delayed my arrival, taking the longest possible route to my desk, my eyes scanning the floor. He wasn't in the war room. He wasn't at his own desk. A part of me was relieved, but a much larger part felt a sinking sense of dread. Maybe he was so mortified that he'd called in sick. Maybe he was avoiding me. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't. The memory was too vivid, too sensory. The faint scent of his skin, the surprising softness of his lips, the way he had looked at me right before and right after. The uncertainty in his eyes was what haunted me the most. He hadn't looked triumphant or predatory. He had looked as scared and confused as I felt. When he finally walked in an hour later, he didn't look at me. He went straight to the coffee machine, his shoulders tense. He exchanged a few words with another coworker, his voice the same easy, confident tone as always. It was like nothing had happened. My burgeoning hope shriveled. It was a fluke. I had misinterpreted everything. He was going to pretend it never happened, and I, in my cowardice, was probably going to let him. The professional boundary was going to be rebuilt, thicker and taller than ever before, and I would be left wondering what could have been. The day was a blur of awkwardness. We were in the same room, sometimes just feet apart, but the space between us felt like a chasm. We communicated through emails and instant messages about project details. The easy camaraderie we had built over the last 2 weeks was gone, replaced by a stiff, painful formality. Every time he walked past my desk, I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up. I'd stare intently at my screen, pretending to be absorbed in my work, while my mind replayed the kiss over and over again. I dissected every frame of the memory. The way he hesitated, the way his hand rested on the doorframe. Was it a cage or a brace? Was the kiss an impulse or a confession? I analyzed it from every angle, searching for data points, for some logical pattern that would explain his behavior and my own reaction. But this wasn't data. This was human, messy, and terrifyingly unpredictable. Fear and hope were at war inside me. The fearful part, the part that had kept me safe in my quiet solitude for years, whispered that I was a fool, that I had read too much into it, that he was probably regretting it, worried that I would make things weird or report him to human resources. It told me to bury the memory, to go back to the way things were, to accept the status quo of admiring him from a safe distance. But the hopeful part, the part that had been nourished by a cup of coffee and a shared jacket, refused to be silenced. It latched onto the memory of his vulnerability, the questioning look in his eyes. It argued that no one kisses someone like that out of pure impulse. There was something there, a spark I hadn't imagined. That hope was both a comfort and a torture. It made the silence between us unbearable. It made me want to scream, to just walk over to him and ask, "What was that? What are we doing?" But I didn't. I couldn't. I was a passive observer in my own life, and I didn't know how to change the script. The day crawled by, each second stretched thin with unspoken tension, and I went home feeling more alone than I had in years. The tension stretched into the next day, a Friday. It was a tangible thing, an invisible wall between us and the war room. Our other team members, now that the main crisis was over, were in and out of the room more frequently, and their cheerful chatter only highlighted the strained silence between Caleb and me. We were polite. We were professional. We were two strangers who happened to have shared the most intimate moment of my life. I had resigned myself to the idea that it would never be addressed. We would finish Project Nightingale. He would go back to his side of the office. I would go back to mine, and the memory of that kiss would become a strange, secret artifact I would carry with me forever. It was a sad, pathetic conclusion, but it felt safer than the alternative. Late that afternoon, just as I was packing up my bag, Eager to escape into the anonymity of the weekend, an instant message popped up on my screen. It was from Caleb. My heart leaped into my throat. The message was simple, just a few words. Got a minute to talk? I stared at the blinking cursor, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was it. The confrontation I had been dreading and secretly craving. I typed back, sure, my hands feeling clumsy and disconnected from my body. His reply came instantly. Meet me on the rooftop deck. The rooftop deck was a mostly unused perk of our office building. A few sad-looking potted plants and some metal tables, but it had a decent view of the city. More importantly, it would be empty. My mind raced. He was going to apologize. He was going to tell me it was a mistake and ask me to forget it ever happened. I needed to prepare myself, to build up my defenses. When I stepped out onto the deck, the cool evening air was a welcome shock. Caleb was already there, leaning against the railing, looking out at the skyline. He turned as I approached, and his face was etched with an anxiety that mirrored my own. The confident, easygoing project manager was gone. This was the same vulnerable man I had seen in the hallway. Hey, he said, his voice quiet. Thanks for coming up. I just nodded, stuffing my hands in my pockets, unable to think of anything to say. We stood in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the city traffic rising up from below. Finally, he broke the silence. Look, Lucas, he started, turning to face me fully. About the other night. I am so sorry. There it was. The apology. That it was a mistake. My heart sank. I braced myself. But then he continued, and what he said was not what I expected at all. I'm sorry for how I handled it. For just walking away. That was cowardly. I freaked out. He took a breath, running a hand through his hair. The kiss itself. I'm not sorry for that. I looked up at him, shocked. My brain struggled to catch up. He wasn't sorry for the kiss. He met my eyes, and his gaze was direct, earnest. I've wanted to do that for a long time, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Longer than you'd probably believe. My mouth felt dry. What? I managed to croak out. He let out a short, self-deprecating laugh. Is it that surprising? Lucas, I notice things. I notice how you get this little line between your eyebrows when you're concentrating. I notice that you always pick the plain donut, never the ones with sprinkles. I noticed that you mentioned that coffee shop months ago. He took a step closer. I was just scared. I've only ever dated women. And you were just so quiet and professional. I had no idea if you felt anything, or if I was just projecting. I convinced myself I was. He was revealing everything, laying his own fears and insecurities bare. All this time, I had seen him as this pinnacle of confidence, someone completely unattainable, while he had been watching me with the same uncertainty I felt for him. The secret he revealed wasn't that he was gay or bisexual. It was that he was just as human and just as terrified as I was. When we were working on this project, he continued, his voice gaining a little more strength, and I got to actually be around you, to talk to you. It just got harder and harder to ignore. And that night, when you found that data, and we were both so tired and so relieved, I just couldn't fight it anymore. But then I panicked. I thought I'd crossed a line, that I'd ruined everything. All the air had left my lungs. I finally found my voice. I didn't think you'd even noticed me, I admitted, the words tumbling out. I thought you were just being nice. The jacket, the coffee. Nice. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that finally reached his eyes. Lucas, I was trying to flirt with you, the gentle absurdity of it all, the months of mutual pining and misinterpretation, was almost comical. All that anxiety, all that distance, was built on a foundation of false assumptions. He closed the remaining space between us. He didn't brace his hand against a wall this time. Instead, he gently cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. So, can we try that again? He asked softly. Without the panic attack and the dramatic exit, I couldn't speak, so I just nodded, my heart feeling like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. And then he kissed me again. This kiss was different. It wasn't tentative or questioning. It was sure. It was a mutual acknowledgement, a confirmation of everything that had just been said. It was full of relief and hope and the promise of a beginning. In that moment, on a windy rooftop overlooking the city, the silent, observant analyst and the confident, secretly uncertain project manager finally found their common ground. And it was so much better than I ever could have analyzed or predicted. The weeks that followed the confession on the rooftop felt like waking up from a long dream. The world suddenly seemed more vibrant, more real. The awkwardness between us vanished, replaced by a quiet, thrilling current of shared knowledge. We were a secret, for now, navigating the complexities of an office romance, but it felt less like a burden and more like a wonderful game. A simple glance across the conference table held a new meaning. A brief touch of hands as we reached for the same document sent a spark through my day. We started leaving work at the same time, walking a few blocks in a different direction before we allowed our hands to find each other. We had our first real date at a small Italian restaurant he knew, tucked away on a side street, where we talked for hours, filling in the gaps of the lives we'd only glimpsed from afar. I learned about his strained relationship with his father, his love for old black and white movies, and his ridiculous fear of pigeons. He learned about my passion for vintage science fiction novels, my failed attempts at learning the guitar, and my family back in Ohio. The professional boundary we once had was gone, but in its place, we built something far stronger, a connection based on honesty and a surprising amount of shared laughter. Project Nightingale, the catalyst for everything, wrapped up successfully. We gave our final presentation side by side, a seamless team. No one else in that room knew that the lead analyst and the lead project manager had been up until 2 in the morning the night before, not working, but debating the cinematic merits of Casablanca. One Saturday, a couple of months later, we were at my apartment. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that was perfect for doing nothing at all. He was lying on the sofa, his head in my lap, as I idly ran my fingers through his hair. He was sketching in his old notepad, the same one he used at work, but this time he was drawing the view from my apartment window. The quiet intimacy of the moment was so profound, so deeply comfortable, it almost made my chest ache. He looked up at me, his pencil stilled. "You know," he said, a thoughtful look in his eyes, "if Maria had never greenlit that insane project, we might still just be saying morning, Lucas, and morning, Caleb to each other for the next 10 years, I smiled down at him. Probably, I admitted. I was never going to be brave enough to do anything about it. Me neither, he said, and the honesty in his voice was a gift. I was terrified. It was a beautiful reaffirmation of how far we had come. We had both been trapped in our own anxieties, our own preconceived notions about each other. It took a forced proximity, a war room, to break down those walls. It's funny how you can spend your life trying to control all the variables, trying to predict every outcome and minimize every risk. I had built my world on the foundation of what was safe and what was known. I lived in the quiet comfort of the expected. But love, it turns out, is the unexpected variable you can never account for. It's the anomaly in the data, the event that changes all the projections. And sometimes, the bravest and most wonderful thing you can do is stop analyzing and just let it happen.